Here's something I just spotted in the newsagent. Mojo's collector series, Echoes, 1965 to 2025, Pink Floyd. Now this is a magazine that cost €22, if you can believe that, or 14 pounds sterling, which is pretty expensive. I suppose I was in some mood just to waste money on a magazine and then saw this, which is more like a book, really. It is, I have to say, beautifully produced, lovely glossy paper, which is really what convinced me to buy it. Is it's really is beautifully made. Now, I didn't really have the intention to turn this channel into a music channel because, one, I'm not a boomer and I don't spend any money on deluxe box sets. I really only spend money very occasionally on vintage vinyl. But to me, music books are like a kind of literary junk food. So I couldn't resist getting this. Let's see now. I've got a better picture. It has this beautiful glossy paper. I said before, if you raise children only interacting with digital technology, laptops and phones and pads, you're missing out on an incredible tactile experience. Because a child just feeling the texture, the different texture of things, holding it in their hand, is a learning experience about the world they're in. And when you remove that analog contact with the world, you become detached from reality and begin to enter a sort of digital simulacrum and end up like some character in the wall. I will say though, if you find yourself touching this paper, this beautifully produced soft paper, that is a sign you need to go on a date. Anyway, Sid became an eccentric, which was fine because eccentricity was licensed in Cambridge. In Dublin, what we used to have were characters, but thankfully they brought out a vaccine for that. I thought this was funny, surveying the crowd at a Bob Dylan concert in 1964. Sid turned to his girlfriend and declared, "Look, it's the me and you from every town." I find that funny because even at such a late stage in human history, as the past 10 years, I've had the same experience. When I was exploring the countercultural streams of the 20th century, I read Allen Ginsberg, I read Stranger in a Strange Land, which is really quite tedious. The Guru. It's interesting, Sid went down or attempted to go down the Guru road, but was rejected. And one of those things that's debated about, was he better off? Did it make him feel worse? I mean, I love all that 60s countercultural music. Then in retrospect, it only seemed to be, you know, maybe around 500 people who lived in London at the time. And what I find fascinating with Pink Floyd is that the journey was always more interesting than the destination. It's the amateur quality of how things were done in that mid to late 60s period. It's when people do things for the love of it, not out of commercial and business reasons. You know, the modern concert industry was created as it went along. As people discovered the flash in the pan, pop star was worth a lot of money. And there's two ways bands often make music. One is where they allow themselves to develop in public, recording what they can with the talent they have at that moment in time. Where you could say every project is an unfinished project that's then released to the public, saying this is where we are. And then the other way of making music is where everything is done in private in rehearsal rooms and studios, and then you present something very polished as a finished product to the audience. I mean, I often think like the band Television had pretty much worked out what they wanted to do around 1974, 1975. But their debut album, Marquee Moon, didn't come out until 1977, when they'd really sort of worked out exactly what they wanted to do. So you can say it's a reflection of personalities between those who are in a kind of open, creative experience and those who are more private and perfectionist. So I'd say the majority of Pink Floyd fans really aren't interested in anything prior to metal. And well, I find everything from 67 to 71 fascinating. It's all what they could call the man on the journey. Just edit out some noise there. The kaleidoscopic cover of the first album. It's funny, it's only really with the second album, Saucer Full of Secrets, do they find sort of appropriate psychedelic pop culture imagery to go with their music. Well, the debut's album cover is still very much of kind of 60s pop music. Certainly one of the best debut albums of the 60s, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. But 1967 is a really fascinating year. You know, I often think, looking back at the kind of original classic rock era, that rock, I would say you can make a good argument, rock music really begins in 1966 when you have people like Jeff Beck, the first Cream album, and the Beatles' Revolver, which has that incredible guitar sound. So 66 is the beginning. It feels like that era runs through to 1973, so that's like a 7-year cycle. What happened before was rock and roll, pop music, rhythm and blues, jazz, folk. The rock is something born out of people experimenting and playing in small clubs. You know, it's amazing looking back, you know, a band like Cream playing to like high school audiences, and Pink Floyd playing their improvised shows, you know, to 100 people, a few hundred people. people wondering, is this even music or is this pure sensation? You know, music to take acid to. And Lucifer Sam, the Siam cat. Years ago, someone phoned me and profusely apologized for disturbing the baby. But the baby was a Siamese cat because there was nothing louder on this earth. Pointing at the sky. I like those early singles, the singles after Sid, when Rick Wright was trying to develop his songwriting craft. But he didn't sort of have the personality to, or desire to become the dominant songwriter after Sid left. There's definitely a kind of musical continuum in Pink Floyd with Rick Wright, where he is so much of that sound of the debut album as well, and his keyboards sort of take you through a conceptual continuity really from their debut in 67 to Animals in 77, a 10-year career. You know, to me The Wall, it seems more like, you know, it's like a Broadway show or something. Good reminder that you should always sleep inside a triangular pyramid in your bedroom. I like those early Mojo Waters songs as well, you know. Set the controls for Heart of the Sun and all that. I've never read any Michael Moorcock, I have to admit, which I should remedy, because he was such an influence on that London counterculture at the time, and Hawkwind, all that. See it in his Dionysian pose. I do love those solo albums he made. I think they are creatively superior to the debut. You know, the debut is fantastic as a kind of phantasmagorical recollection of childhood. And then The Madcap Laughs is like the adult lost, the loneliness of modern world, and where people keep putting acid in your tea, allegedly. Iggy the Eskimo, you know, who's on the back cover. Someone had a whole website dedicated to her, and strange characters that pass through your life. I always think that is a great, as I was saying, the album cover to A Saucer Full of Secrets is brilliant. There's meant to be, well, it's easier to see on an actual album cover, but they have, they cut out little bits from, I think, Doctor Strange comic book. I don't know if that is part of it or... Back when we were all less concerned with copyright. Ummagumma. Exactly that, experimentation in process. I always thought it was a very bad idea, you know, the concept for them all to do solo pieces and then put them on an album together. What would have made more sense would have been for them to compose their solo pieces and then have the band perform them on the album. For instance, you know, Roger Waters' Grantchester Meadows, you know, it's a great song, but the best version of it is when it was performed by a band on the KQED TV show, because you get Roger and David playing guitar together, and you get Rick playing really beautiful bit of keyboard with it, and the whole album should have been done like that. But it's that idea of experimentation, of like, what can we do that's different? And Adam Hart and Mother, their first UK #1 album, which is amazing to think how in that post psychedelic era, it's like record companies weren't really sure what was happening with the youth culture, counterculture, what would sell or what wouldn't sell. So they let people experiment and do whatever they wanted, really. Pink Floyd making the album in collaboration with what's his name, Ron Geese and guys. But I have to say, I've always wanted a T-shirt with famous cow, and then you'd have written here the Sex Pistols. I always wanted to get that T-shirt. Also, it's important to remember though, if you pause this video at any point, you are breaking the law, and you will be sent to a gulag. Yeah, Ron Geeson. Yeah, it's an interesting character. Zabriskie Point. One of those, well, for me, one of those sort of late night movies to watch in the 90s in fascination. There's a lot there that overlaps with the deranged far left attitudes of today. It's fascinating time capsule films like that. Pink Floyd were always collaborating with, or looking for these collaborations with other artists, filmmakers. Pompeii, which was just in the cinemas. I was very surprised reading online, some reviews of people talking about the Life of Pompeii film. It surprised me so many people hadn't seen it before, because to me that again is a classic, like sort of 90s late night movie to watch with a block of hash or something, It definitely seems with a lot of bands, the context of their time gets lost, and new fans don't have any real context for the surrounding culture. But I've always been interested in history. Well, I think most people just enjoy these things as a kind of consumer product. Yeah, I thought this was a funny picture, where the photographer had obviously asked them, cover your eyes. But it gives that funny sense of what's the symbolism going on there. If you cover one eye, what's going on if you cover both eyes? Though Rick is peeking out. I mean, I've often wondered, it's impossible not to consider how free ultimately any of these bands were when they signed a deal with the devil. I mean, it's really amazing in retrospect how much freedom Pink Floyd had at EMI to do crazy experiments like their household objects. It seems like EMI wanted a band to be like a figurehead, a band that would be an experiment in how audio-visual entertainment could be put together for an audience. I mean, you see that direct line from Pink Floyd playing in the UFO club to playing vast stadiums, an industry created in real time. And you have to wonder to what extent there was a co-ownership of those experiments, with the military-industrial complex or Tavistock or whatever. It's hard to believe they were truly free. It always seems you're free within the limits of a gilded cage. See, it's funny with there's Roger, I think, with his ex-wife and some kittens. It's hard to see. But there you go. I mean, see, he can't be all bad. Oh, Roger. His brain is maybe... He does have maybe some slight brain damage from the socialist rantings, but that was very much of his generation and time. The strange overlap between experimental progressive artists and left-wing socialist politics in the Britain of the 60s and 70s. Someone as liberated as Robert Wyatt being an avowed communist. And you always have to ask, if they lived in a communist society, did they believe a band like Soft Machine or Pink Floyd would ever have been allowed to exist? Obviously not. Picture there Claire Torrey, who did the famous vocals, the guest vocals. It's funny because a lot of people probably presumed she was black. Decades later, of course, she got her credit, which was deserved, really. I mean, one of the terrible things with bands when they're making a lot of money is all the arguments over credits and royalties and all of that. Bands are always better off just splitting things equally, four-way split. It's like, I don't think Rick Wright got any he didn't get any songwriting credits on Animals, but he plays his keyboards all through it, Yeah, I wish you were here. Like, it's strange from that, the music that's made them legendary is, Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals on the Wall. And its incredible commercial success seems to point to some sort of unexpressed melancholy and mild depression of their male listeners. It's how music offers this key to a door to feel emotions that you had suppressed or ignored within yourself. That's its power. But that emotional truth, those spiritual revelations are always muddied by the commercial nature of pop, rock music, the entertainment industry. And we're guided to only interact and enjoy these things as a commercial product. And when I look at online music forums, it always feels like people are buying these incredibly expensive, lavish box sets because they're trying to get to some point back in their youth, like to that initial feeling of wonder and enthusiasm and excitement. But that can't be achieved through buying products. It's a strange thing. It's interesting to have this picture of Sid, which I think was from like the early 80s, because it's a bit unfortunate that the pictures of Sid from the Wish You Were Here sessions, where he looks a bit crazy with a shaved head and he looks a bit overweight. While there's a number of pictures from Sid in the early 80s you can see online where he looks more like a normal, ordinary person. You know, I'm the type of person who's always inclined towards a more romantic reading of artists and history, and I think one thing Sid realised was how terrible the music industry was and how it turned people into a puppet. You know, to be in the music industry meant rubbing shoulders with very dodgy people, gangsters, managers, music promoters, corporations. You know, people like Jimmy Savile. You know, that's what it meant to be successful in the music industry, was to work with people like that. And you think, was he so crazy to prefer to want to drop out and just paint? I mean, he was very lucky, you know. I often think, you know, Roger Waters famously divided the human race via George Orwell into dogs, sheep, and pigs, when he seemed to forget that his bandmate was a cat. You know, Sid was a cat. He lived the life of a cat. He lived on his royalties and did whatever he wanted till the end of his life. It's debatable what went on in his mind, or if it's a tragedy that he didn't make more music, or if he wanted to make more music. It's impossible to know. And of course, the strange story of Pink Floyd, or I suppose just a sad story, is, you know, a group of friends who end up turning into colleagues, into strangers, with the more wealth and fame they achieved. This picture, you know, is really appalling. I don't know what that is from originally, if that was from an advert or what. John Lydon there with his I hate t-shirt. Of course, the funny thing is, what Roger Waters was expressing wasn't that different. It is such a strange thing, you know, when if you're a Pink Floyd fan and you get that train that goes into London from the airport. I can't remember which airport. It's so long now since I've been in London. I can't remember. Is it Stansted or Heathrow, where you get a train that comes in and you go right past the Battersea Power Station? It's surreal. The edifice of the old industrial world. The incredible melancholy Wish You Here. You know, see, I never listened to these albums that much. You know, I could listen to Wish You Were Here and Animals maybe once a year, or even once every 2 years. You know, there's great music on Animals, but it's just extraordinarily depressing stuff. The Wall. I've seen the film of The Wall once. Probably as much Bob Geldof. content as anybody could take. Final quite interesting Ford coming in that era of the Falklands War, because very few people were going to say anything about it. But again, very depressing. I mean, it's almost just Roger speaking over the music, and that's the point where he thinks the band is over. But Gilmour and Mason come back and make this kind of ersatz simulacrum, sort of corporate simulacrum of Pink Floyd. And of course, the great thing was it meant people got to see them live in the 80s and the 90s. But Momentary Lapse of Reason is, it does really sound like what it is, music made by committee. Like there's that story of, David ringing around other famous musicians and saying, do you have any concepts? You have to laugh. But I think, and then, the division bell. The Division Bell, it's a listenable album, but to me it has a very, very kind of strong, sort of dad rock vibe, just kind of mellow, middle-aged music, some few kind of psychedelic touches, nice like guitar sounds. It was good that Rick Wright, you had new Rick Wright songs on an album. And it's just that thing, it's good to do things when you have the time, you have the moment, The sand is endlessly falling through, and when you have that moment to do something, when you have the energy to do it, and they did it at the right time and then pretty much retired. Now, of course, Rick Wright then went on playing in David Gilmour's band after that. But I have to say, I'm really not a big David Gilmour fan. I think he was a very clever person in avoiding ending up with the career of somebody like Mick Taylor, who thought he could do so much more outside the Stones, but never really got a solo career together. I really knew what he wanted to do. He probably imagined he could have gone into kind of jazz fusion stuff, but by the time he got his first solo album out, that moment of kind of guitar, instrumental and fusion stuff had kind of already passed. And Gilmour has never been a great songwriter. So he was very canny, very clever to the way he's marketed it himself, and collaborated with people. But I find his solo albums incredibly boring. He is a great musician, but he's never been a great songwriter. Sid was a natural. I think at its most basic level, music can be described as being either vertical or horizontal. And there are bands that do both types of music on the same album. But ultimately, Sid was vertical. Piper the Great Stone is vertical music. And everything Gilmour has done since the 80s is, I would say, is horizontal music. It's just a very simple metaphor. But it's just that difference in personality, and how bands are always a strange collection of personalities rubbing in friction against one another until they inevitably implode. And of course, Sid was Roger. Sid was his nickname. A completely unique, idiosyncratic, creative person. Richard Wright. Maybe one of the most underrated keyboard players of that kind of prog rock era. When you had, compared to like Yes and ELP and all that stuff. Rick gave the music such kind of ethereal and classical sort of edge to the music. His keyboard playing is just wonderful. And he has a good collection of songs, that he wrote, like Summer 68, Stay, Wearing the Inside Out, And as I said, he really should have got more songwriting credits just as being a collaborator. Yeah, and then, Louder Than Words just was appalling. Having Polly, write those lyrics, it's just, it is, I don't know, it's certainly like embarrassment to it, The final album that came out, was listenable, the Endless River, but the final song, was just terrible. And Nick Mason, one person you could imagine having a conversation with in the pub. A very strange collection of characters. It's often funny that, the way the band like Pink Floyd, that unlike the Beatles and Rolling Stones, is that the fans themselves like split off into sectarian camps, like different religious denominations in conflict with each other. John Lennon fans, Paul McCartney fans, Mick Jagger fans, Keith Richards fans, David Gilmour fans, Roger Waters fans. But it's very funny because we don't know any of these people, and we project so much onto them. We project so much love onto them, onto people we've never met. And it's always quite misguided because you can love the artist's work, but it's just crazy to say you love any of these people, any of your favorite artists, when all you know is a picture of their face and the sound of their music. I mean, when you read about the Pink Floyd sectarian conflict, people dislike Roger because he comes across as kind of the arrogant, loud-mouthed man ranting at clouds, But I think his heart has always been in the right place. A difficult person. I will say, he does have a certain fearless quality about raising subjects in the public consciousness that other artists wouldn't touch. But ultimately, he's still part of that same billion-dollar machine. Because as far as I'm aware, Roger said absolutely nothing about the jab. So what can you do? And then people who find Roger too much or who disagree with his politics often prefer David Gilmour because, Gilmour had that voice that soft melodic voice on so many of their songs. And he comes across as very polite, English, soft-spoken person. But you only have to look below the surface, I think, to see that in many ways David comes across as a very kind of passive-aggressive person. And seeing him fully embrace the yellow and blue flag, and I believe he has some sort of family connection to Ukraine, but seeing him coming down on the side of the war machine, it's just appalling. And seeing the comments that him and his wife have made publicly, on Twitter and whatever, for me, at the end of his career, Gilmour has really jumped the shark. And then when those characters seem too much, people often talk about Rick Wright, because Rick Wright comes across as the the sensitive introvert who kind of got bullied out of having more songs on their classic albums. But then when you read about his personal life, he also comes across as a pretty appalling person. Of course, I didn't know him. I only know what I've read. But the idea that maybe if you don't like Roger and you don't like David, then Rick could be your pin-up. He seems as just a difficult character as any of them. Which leaves you Nick, who amazingly went back on tour doing the early music. And it's funny, Nick really seems like the only person you could kind of imagine having a normal conversation with. And Sid, at least up until the Live Aid concert, you could kind of imagine knocking on his door in Cambridge. But I never wanted to do that because he didn't owe anybody anything. The gift is the music, and your emotional, spiritual reaction belongs to you, the listener. The key that opens the door to your own half-forgotten dreams.